morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's Surge Series webcast. I'm Claire Butterfield, the Program Director at the Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Foundation, or ISEIF. As with the other items in the series, this conversation is focused on an unanswered question, and the question is, who has our backs? The electricity sector has undergone major changes in recent years, with more potentially on the horizon. How can advocacy organizations take a proactive role in making sure that consumers are foremost in these changes? Our featured guest today is Janine Migden Ostrander, who's a principal at the Regulatory Assistance Project, a global nonprofit team of experts that provides technical and policy assistance to policymakers and regulators on a broad range of energy and environmental issues. Our featured grantee guest is Kristen Munch, the Policy Director at the Citizens Utility Board, which works on behalf of Illinois consumers through educational outreach and policy advocacy. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
If you're watching on Google Hangouts and you would like to submit a question, click on the little white grid in the upper corner of your screen and switch from Showcase to the Q&A app. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions if we see them come in. I want to put this in a little bit of context, which is that the grid is a physical thing, our power grid. It's a set of wires. And because we decided at some point in our history that we didn't want to have competing sets of wires all over our landscape, we decided we would have effectively a monopoly. And so utilities exist in a regulatory structure that's unusual for businesses. And in that context, Janine, I want to start with a question for you. What are the most important policy decisions that affect the residential energy sector that will be made in the next 5 years or so, both at the national and at the state levels?
Well, I think that for consumers, location matters. So it depends upon what's going on in your state, how progressive a state you are, whether the state is really involved in traditional regulation in terms of how quickly things are changing and what will matter. For example, does your state have choice? Is there AMI metering available? How much energy efficiency and demand response is there? Is it bid into the market? Is demand response able to bid into an organized market? And what are the direction made difficult or easy? So all of these factors, which vary from state to state, will have an impact on the policies going forward in these states. And perhaps some of the more advanced states that have taken the lead on these issues will provide lessons learned that can be shared with other states that may want to then pick up on some of these policy objectives. But things that will be important will be rate design. For example, as more customer options continue to grow, where you're seeing more and more customers taking control over their own usage through distributed generation, PV, energy efficiency, and other things, the question becomes, what happens to the remaining customers? How does that impact their rates as utilities see their revenues declining due to reduced sales? Rate design issues is customers and should probably be done on an optional basis. Will be important. We'll see that. Also, implementation of the Clean Power Plan. And that will also vary state by state, depending upon what the requirements are to comply. But it also represents an opportunity to increase energy efficiency availability for all customers, which is a least cost option on a system-wide basis, but also helps the individual customer. And then finally, other things like paying for infrastructure to strengthen the grid. That's going to raise rates for customers, and that's something that needs to be done across the nation. And when that happens, that's going to put more stress on rates for all customers, but especially the low-income community. So we need to be sensitive to that concern.
So how does RAP seek to influence and shape policy decisions like these? And can you give us some examples of your favorite success stories?
Governments and regulatory agencies on environmentally and economically sustainable clean energy policies. And we do so in a number of ways. If we're asked by a commission that's considering, for example, what they want to do an integrated resource plan. Can we help them figure out how to do that best? Or any number of issues. We've worked with the New York Commission on the REV process, and so that's one way we do it. We also write a lot of papers that are available on our website, www.raponline.org, which I would recommend the viewers go to, because we have a host of papers on a whole lot of issues. And we've also assisted NACA on the menu of options to come up with 26 different kinds of recommendations on so provide assistance in those ways. One example would be the work we just did with NACA on the Clean Power Plan. Another example is a deep dive we did in Arkansas to help them figure out a comprehensive energy efficiency program, from the goals to the incentive mechanisms to the recovery mechanisms for utilities and dealing with lost revenues.
Thanks, Janine. Kristen, I want to turn to you now and ask you, from CUB's perspective, what are the most effective strategies for ensuring that policy decisions here are good for residential consumers?
I mean, I think, given that our work that we've done, and I agree with Nina, in fact, on a lot of the policy drivers. I think Illinois is a good example. It's similar to Ohio in that there's a lot of different ways to engage in policy. So I think it's a broad question. How we do it probably depends on the topic and precisely what we're trying to influence. So if we start with where I think a lot of those policy drivers are going, which is what's going to be the way that we pay for distribution utility service in the future because of the pressures, the things Janine identified that are putting pressure on them, what would be a successful way to engage in that is probably on a lot of different fronts. I mean, I think it's a legislative question, I think it's a regulatory question, I think it's a wholesale market question. So we're involved in a lot of aspects. We're heavily involved at PJM, which is the wholesale market, which takes the form of comments, and we have I'm on the board of an organized consumer advocacy organization now that we have for work here in Illinois. A lot of it's done in front of the Commerce Commission, but a lot of it's also done through, what would you say, I guess, the ongoing grassroots stakeholder meetings that we do. It's being engaged with the broader community, because I think the challenges that Janine identified are drawing together a lot of new players, consumer advocates, environmental organizations, and others. So a lot of the policy work we do, in part, is trying to get to, think outside the box, think out to groups outside of the box that maybe haven't traditionally been engaged, and see what their perspectives are. How successful we are probably remains to be seen. But I think if we count success as having a sustainable utility model that focuses on delivering benefits to customers like energy efficiency, demand response, reliability, and resiliency, then I think we'll consider that to be a success. Getting there will probably take all types of advocacy, across the board.
So what would you say are the critical changes that we've seen in the utility landscape over the last several years? It seems as if we've already gone through quite a few changes, and it's taking a while for consumers to catch up to the knowledge of what the market really looks like for them now.
I think probably the biggest thing is that a lot of the changes we have, consumers are very, to your point, don't need to know about particularly. Say the deployment of AMI, the advanced meters themselves don't really do much. They will enhance reliability, they'll enhance response times, but in terms of what we want consumers to take advantage of, understanding how things are priced, understanding their opportunities to conserve energy, and that's being the slowest part that a lot of us are working on. It's forcing the program development to go along with that, and I think, so I would take the AMI as a good example, at least for Illinois. It's probably that and deregulation, the decision to separate our supply from our delivery services. That's opened up a lot of opportunity. It has not opened up as much opportunity in terms of delivering energy efficiency services or optional time of use rates like we would like. And a lot of what we're working on now is focused around unlocking the potential for that, because I think you're right. Consumers, I think, have not yet seen, at least in Illinois, directly the benefits that I think they thought were coming with this infrastructure investment that they're being asked to pay for. And
Right.
It's our job to try and help them, and regulators and the utilities focus on delivering those benefits. And that, you're right, it's taken a while, and we're just now getting to where we're working on the data, time of use, community solar, and these other things that are enabled by those investments, but aren't, if left on their own devices, won't realize without having someone push for them.
Yeah, yeah, and I think from the consumer's point of view, it's hard to look outside the window. You see one set of wires coming into your house, and it's hard to understand that you have some choices, which don't include hooking up to somebody else's set of wires, but you still have choices. So getting folks to learn that has already been a challenge. Janine, what do you think the future holds for residential consumers? What are the changes that are on the horizon that are coming, and over what time period do you think they're going to show up?
Well, I think the utility industry is in an evolutionary period, and I think that what we're seeing in some areas is somewhat of a customer revolution, where customers are taking more control over their energy usage, whereas we used to be pretty much beholden to a centralized utility system that delivered energy to customers. We're now seeing customers engaging in energy efficiency, demand response, and also, constructing PV facilities on their rooftops, thereby controlling more of their energy usage. So this is a big change, and I think that the availability of storage, as we've seen like with the Tesla batteries, that's going to be a real game changer if customers can start to store some of the solar power that they're generating during the day for use during off-peak periods. So a lot of change is on some impact on the utility industry as a whole in terms of decisions to retire fossil fuel plants and to replace them, hopefully with more renewable energy, and figuring out how to integrate that renewable energy into the grid. Demand response will play an important role in terms of helping with that integration, and so there'll be more of an emphasis on getting customers to address demand response, and that can be through time of use rates, and it could be for larger customers through demand response products. So there's a number of ways, there are a number of opportunities available for customers. Also, what we'll see on the horizon is more and more customers perhaps getting smart meters and the capabilities that that might present. But on the smart meter front, I do want to point that with the smart meters, I think they're totally underutilized from a consumer perspective. When utilities started talking about smart meters, we had hoped that there would be a lot more options for time of use rates that would give customers the ability to reduce their usage, to respond to price signals, and we're just not seeing that. And so that's been somewhat of a disappointment by the utility, from the utility industry. We see a lot of pilots, but nothing full, not enough full-scale programs that can really, move the needle on usage.
What do you think is, either of you, what do you think is holding up the development of rates that are maybe simpler and therefore more appealing to customers?
I guess I would say I'm not sure that it's a question of the rates being simple or appealable to customers. I think when we go out and do outreach events, I think oftentimes customers, as you say, first start with, my bill has gone up and I would like it to go down. And I think it's a question of not feeling like they have options, but not so many options, that's overwhelming, right? I think the key is to have a few different, 2 or 3 different options. So I guess simple in terms of a menu, but the rates themselves can be, like real-time pricing can save a lot of people money. It's a great rate. I don't think it's necessarily that complicated for a customer to understand what you're getting, as it depends on the market. I think the rate design itself there is pretty straightforward. Time of use can be difficult to design, but easy for a customer to understand, and easy to opt into. I think what's holding back a lot of this is, I think, that the incentives of those utilities who have deployed this technology are not focused on treating a customer as something other than someone with a meter who is there to simply support kind of an infrastructure. I think the incentives aren't really there to engage them in a way to offer them a suite of a suite of rate options that say, okay, find the rate that's best for you, and here's how we can recover this. I think when customers begin to understand that they have options, I think once you go through and talk to them when they come and say, my bill is high, what can I do about it? And we could give them 2 or 3 options. I think there's actually like a real-time pricing peak time rebate has been very successful where we've been able to get into the field for customers to engage on that. They get it. I think what's holding it back is the utilities, as Janine said, are not nearly as aggressively promoting those kind of rates or working to make them available to customers as maybe we thought they would.
I think if I can add to that, I think customer education is really important. And I think that there is an opportunity to put out a lot more information for customers about what are time of use rates, how can they work, what are peak time rebates, and how can they function. Peak time rebates are really customers because it's sort of a no fault, no penalty kind of a rate. If you participate, you can get a certain amount of savings. If you don't participate, you pay the same rate and there's no penalty. Another tool that I think that could be very helpful for customers is shadow billing. So for example, if you have a time of use rate or a customer is not on the time of use rate, you send the customer their typical bill and then you have with that bill you say, you give them information that says, if you were on a time of use rate, this is how much your bill would be. And so customers can do a comparison and take a look at how they're using energy, when they're using energy, and what the prices are they're paying under a traditional rate or what they would pay under a time of use rate, and see the advantages to perhaps switching to a time of use rate. You know, there are tools like this that are out there that would be really good to help educate customers and move them more in these when, such as France, for example, they've had time of use rates and demand rates for over 20 years. So it's certainly, you know, for all residential customers. So it's certainly doable.
We have some grantees who've been working on applications that third-party applications that can follow your usage pattern and then send you a little push notification that says, based on how you use your energy, this product might be better for you. And it seems as if having the ability for third-party developers to get customer data may be what cracks this open. Just as we had cell phones for a while and they had GPS capacity in them, but until third parties could access that and play with it, and the products that made it useful, that gave you a map function on your phone, didn't really get developed. So we need some good minds to have access to this information. I want to move to the question of cost, and I want to frame this with some care, because one of ISEIF's charges is to provide 30% of our funding to support low-income and low-income senior customers. So we know through the work of our grantees that money matters in many of the households in our state, but electricity is relatively cheap in Illinois, and that makes it hard for some households to make it a priority, because the financial rewards of doing that may be lower than spending that time on some other issue in your household. So what are incentives that are non-financial that might get people to engage with this?
I mean, I think it much like the question of, I mean, so to take the example of third-party apps, you know, they've been around for a long time, and so I think it really, those tend to be targeted at folks who have, as you say, are probably not low-income or not low-income seniors or non-English speakers. So I think when it comes to engaging customers, it's a question of which customer and how, and going to meet that customer with what's their concern. I mean, I've been at conferences where there have been a lot of presentations on market segmentation of utility customers, and it turns out they're basically just like any other set of customers. So there are some who are motivated by environmental concerns. There are some who, as you say, who are motivated by financial concerns for whatever reason. There are some who are motivated by the gadgetry of the fun of, you know, turning your house on and off at, you know, when you leave. I'm sure, like Janine has been at pretty much every conference, there's a demo of somebody's new, like, we'll disaggregate your usage and show you how to do it. And I have friends who would love that. I think the challenge is what we found at CUB that's really successful, and I think our our outreach director, Sarah, does a great job of this with her team, is taking people at the point where they're concerned. So, how can we reach them? What motivates them? When the bill changes, when they have a question, when something happens, it's having groups that are out there that are able to walk in and say, okay, this is your question. Take that as the opportunity to educate on, it turns out you actually don't get your supply from the same place, you get this. And here are some rates, or here are some apps that we've worked on that it turns out can help you manage that, and not making it seem overwhelming, because I think for low-income individuals, for seniors, for folks who worry about it, we sometimes tend to focus on other customers and forget that for them it's a scary, I mean, it's an essential service, and it's a scary thought to think that you may or may not be able to afford an essential service. So reaching them at that point, hopefully before that point, and being able to offer them some options and some help, whether it's efficiency, whether it's a rate, whether it's an application that gets them when they're concerned, I think that works great for them. For other individuals, it's Nest has presented a lot of data on what motivates people on thermostats, and half the people liked it because it was cool looking. I mean, those guys, right? It's interesting, I think, for a lot of us in a space that has not been traditionally perhaps as innovative or innovative at all. That's probably an understatement of the century, that we're now looking at having to engage consumers on a much different level. And first off, I guess, treat them like consumers, like people who have an option, who have a choice, and who are motivated by different things, and understanding that for each customer, it's probably going to be.
Yeah, that is a big shift in the energy market. Janine, what are you seeing as incentives other than a pricing structure that really seem to work with consumers?
Well, I think that environmental concerns also are sending customers bills saying, this is how much you use, this is what your neighbors in a similarly sized home use, and people saying, wow, I'm an energy guzzler, that's not good. Those kinds of things have incented customers, and I would agree with Kristen on everything she said. But I want to go back to the point that cost is still a driver. Cost is a very important driver for the low-income community. You have approximately a third of customers that are low-income and are struggling to pay their bills. So if you offer them different kind of rate structures or different kinds of programs that give them the opportunity to conserve energy, reduce their rates, reduce their bills, that's going to be a driver for them. For upper income customers, it's less so, because the amount that they can save is not as significant to them as it is for a low income customer. So while we're looking at all of these other side is the fact that cost is still a very strong motivation for at least a third of our population, if not more.
So are there times when, for example, environmental impacts and consumers' interests are at odds, and the pricing structure, I suppose, could feed this? It might be environmentally beneficial for energy prices to reflect the full environmental cost of producing the energy, but that might not be in the consumer interest. So what is your experience of having these interests come into conflict?
Well, when I was the Consumers Counsel, I felt that there was not a conflict between environmental issues and consumer issues, because what I was looking for was, what are the least cost option? If you line up all the supply side options, all the resource options, energy efficiency comes in as the least cost, even if you count in environmental externalities, even if you count in incentives and lost revenues. It's still the least cost option over a fossil fuel plant, a gas plant. And wind recently, interestingly, in the Lazar study that came out in September of 2014, wind came in as the second least cost option. And utility scale solar is now competitive with a natural gas fired facility. So given this, when you're looking at planning for customers, you can look at things in sort of the short-term range of, what is it going to cost the customer today? Or you could take a long-term view of like a 20-year forecast, which is what you do in an IRP proceeding, and say, what's cost? And I believe it was better to be, not be penny wise and pound foolish about this and look at what are the long-term benefits. Where are customers going to be better off? Are they going to be better off paying for energy efficiency today or paying for a coal plant or a natural gas plant or some other kind of plant later? And so I see a lot of compatibility between the two. Where I do see there is a challenge emerging today is with distributed generation and customers who are able to take advantage of PV and customers who are not. And we need to address that issue by making community solar available to low-income customers so we can levelize out the field and give them access to those options as well, and develop rate designs that are fair to all customers.
Kristen, I see you nodding your head. I'd love to have you weigh in, particularly on the Illinois front.
Yeah, I think maybe 10 years ago when we were talking about first deploying AMI and doing kind of cost benefits, when ComEd did its pilot, I think there was a lot of speculation on whether or not the technologies for things like, rooftop solar or integration of batteries or, integration of any renewable resource would and enabling of energy efficiency, direct load control, demand response was really going to happen. In between the time of the pilot and the time that the legislation was passed that we negotiated, a lot of things have happened, and the cost curve has come down a lot. I think that the long-term environmental interests are absolutely in line with consumers' interests. I think one thing to keep in mind is also that often, our peakiest resources that drive up the cost for everyone often tend to be also very polluting resources. Those often tend to be located in communities that are oftentimes lower income, where there's a disproportionate share of those sort of health and quality of life costs that are being borne. So I think it's absolutely everybody's benefit to do that. I think the point on community solar is a great one. We've worked a lot with Environmental Defense Fund here in Illinois recently on proposing community solar. It's pending at the commission right now. But one of the reasons we wanted to do that was precisely because in a city like Chicago, not everyone has, even if they could afford a rooftop solar PV, right? Not everyone has the ability to do that. I don't. I live in a building where I wouldn't be able to put it on my roof. We wanted to find a way to bring that to the customers to make them have an option to participate in these things. Illinois, I think, has been unique in working on how to capture and integrate those environmental benefits so that it's not an either-or question, maybe the way we thought it was going to be, years ago. And for those customers where we are concerned with that short-term cost, I think we're looking, we need to look out and think about, okay, well, what are the rate designs? What are other programs that can help those customers until the long-term benefits start to get realized? I think your point earlier on, though, data and some of the other things, the interconnection procedures I'll toss out is another one of these sort of regulatory long-term changes we need to make. We do need to get those going now to make sure that the cost of integrating these environmental resources or distributed energy resources like energy efficiency, demand response, storage, and PV are as transparent and as appropriately cost measured as possible. And since those take a long time, I think in order to get those long-term benefits, we have to do a lot of short-term work and get those proceedings going, now, so that we can unlock some of this stuff. Otherwise, there probably will be a question from folks' mind whether or not this is all being done just for kind of those customers who could put solar, and I'm not one of them, so what am I getting out of it? And that's not, I think, what any of us want, because I don't think that's to anyone's benefit to have it perceived that way.
Right. But I am hearing you both say that environmental interests of customers generally and lower income customers are more aligned than we would have expected 10 years ago, and what a great result that is. That's good news. I like good news.
I think particularly the wholesale market, we've done a lot of work in PJM and MISO with a lot of environmental groups, and for the reasons that I think are the biggest drivers of price is the peak. And we've done a lot of coordinated work, and it's been great to work with groups like NRDC, Sierra Club, and others on this kind of how do we make sure distributed energy resources have an option in a wholesale market so that those large-scale benefits can begin to trickle down to all customers.
So how do you see the role of your respective organizations evolving as the energy sector continues to change?
I could jump in, I want to, before I answer that question, I want to just comment on one other thing that Kristen just said, and that is that I think it's really important as we're going through this evolution in the utility, in the power sector, which we like to refer to as power sector transformation, that we pay close attention to low-income customers and we make sure that we have programs in place that are available to low-income customers and that recognize their unique needs that you may have, where you have a lot of people who may be home a lot, like senior citizens that don't leave their homes much, so they have certain different kinds of challenges than people who are out of their home a lot of the day and how they use electricity, and focusing also on energy efficiency programs geared towards low-income customers, so that we can address affordability issues. So I think that that's very important, and I think that there's been a lot of support in the environmental, make sure that we would be remiss if we didn't strongly make that point in this discussion today. With regard to your question about the role of organizations like RAP and CUP, well, for RAP, we like to think of ourselves as being thought leaders, trying to anticipate what is going to be happening in the with power sector transformation and being responsive with ideas and policies. We try to advise governments and regulators on policy, help them think through new initiatives or new directions. And we also, as I mentioned earlier, we write a lot of different papers on these issues. We try to evaluate what's happening in laws and regulations, what's happening with emerging technologies that will influence how customers use energy, so that we can try to be one step ahead and helpful to the power sector at large, regulators, and all the stakeholders, in terms of figuring out how best to move forward in a positive direction that supports economically and environmentally sustainable energy solutions.
I think for CUB it's been already a bit of an evolution, right? I mean, I think that like a lot of consumer advocates, we've got different partnerships than maybe we ever thought we would have. Certainly, I think the partnership with EDF is not one that we envisioned several years ago. I think we've had to become experts in things like data, utility data storage, utility data systems. I find myself talking about latency, which is not something that I really thought I'd spend a lot of time talking about before. I've certainly spent a lot more time on wholesale markets now that we've realized how important those are to having distributed energy resources find a sustainable solution for them. It's also important, for example, we were involved in the Order 745 proceeding at the Supreme Court, in part because what's at stake there is things like the energy efficiency portfolio standard revenues that ComEd, who has been a great utility in terms of bidding those programs into the market, those revenues flow back to ComEd. They use those to expand their EE work. The city of Chicago uses it to help fund their building work. I don't think we ever imagined, really, before we deregulated one and before they began integrating things like DER into the market, that we'd be doing so much time on that. I think the role is going to evolve to hopefully have more of a direct loop. I think CUB is somewhat unique in a consumer advocate because we have such a strong education and outreach arm. We have a direct consumer, I think we, have a lot of field experience that we can bring into a regulatory space in a way that I think a lot of other consumer advocates are going to start doing or be able to do, hopefully. I mean, I'd love to see more of that. Some of it's just statutory. Some of the offices aren't just designed that way. But I think the partnerships across consumer advocates are going to evolve too, because we're between deregulated states. It's going to be a lot more of us needing to share a lot more resources than maybe we thought we were going to need in the future on subjects that most of us were not used to 15 years ago. We didn't have to know about meters or batteries or interconnection or, in a way that we very much now need to. And I think, groups like RAP coming along to help do some of this work on, okay, now let's look at the future. What would a performance rate that has incentives for efficiency look like? What does, what could we use the network that we've all just funded to do that can enhance services? I mean, those are big questions that I mean, at least when I first started coding in whatever it was, 2004, was not something that I think that was on the was being considered. And I think all the groups are having to evolve and wrestle with that at the same time.
And customers are having to evolve. It used to be pretty easy to be an electric customer. You had one company to choose from, and they sent you a bill, and you paid it. But now customers have to change with the times as well and learn that they have choices and figure out the savvy way to make those choices. How can the regulatory how does your role change as the customer role changes?
Our role as changes,
yeah,
okay.
and particularly in the regulatory space, how do you help translate through regulatory changes? How do you help support savvy customer behavior?
Well, I think it's twofold. Like I said, I think it's a loop. I think we understand, or because of the outreach and the events that we do, we understand that a lot of customers may not actually at this point be interested in having options or seeing it evolve. So I think we're sort of continually counseling that educating the consumer for the utility of the future is you have to be very aware of what your sort of basic default customer wants and needs and expects. A lot of them want the lights on at the cheapest price possible. I think that's a perfectly fair and understandable thing. When it comes to translating that into a regulatory space, I think we try to understand how to build a utility of the future that has the systems in place to enable those customers who want to focus on energy management, who want to integrate distributed resources in their homes at a cost, like least cost way, so that everyone can benefit, so that we're building something where the folks who don't want to mess with it and the folks who want to mess with it a lot are all treated equally and are all valued equally in the system. And I think the challenge is we don't quite know how to do that. So I actually don't really have an answer for you yet. I think we'll find out in the next year, as we at least year and a half in Illinois embark on this, what seems likely to be a discussion, whether it's through the commission or through other proceedings, on what the utility of the future should look like. But it's difficult. A lot of it has worked on. I guess I'll say this: we've done a lot of work in terms of over the last years with the electric utilities and the gas utilities, well, but electric, on billing changes. One challenge is that with a lot of folks now, they don't see their bill, right? They do a direct debit and never actually look at the bill. So we've made a lot of good progress. ComEd was great in redesigning their bill in a way I think that was really good. It showed you your usage compared to last month. We were able to do that in part at the ICC and work with them because we had gotten comments and complaints like, what does this mean and where does it work? Now, a challenge for us is going to be, well, now what do we do when you don't see the bill and, in fact, never, it's directly debited from your account? How do we reach them then, and what is it, that we need to do maybe to have ComEd's website send those, notifications, or maybe not. So it's going to be an ongoing challenge, I think.
Yeah. Any final comments that you wanted to share, either of you?
Well, I think if you talk about power sector transformation, which is really an issue that is emerging with a lot of interest among many stakeholders, there are a lot of different forms that it can take, and one of the issues that will need to be addressed is, what is the role of the utility? What is the in the future, whether they are basically sort of a traffic cop, that is directing different third-party vendors who will have access to customers, whether the utility themselves, if they are competing, then we will need codes of conduct to ensure that we have a fair and robust market, because the worst thing you could end up with is a deregulated monopoly. So, and that will then impact the role of commissions, as we've seen with states that have customer choice on the supply side, where the role of the commissions is not so much regulating prices, but regulating the market to make sure that the market is operating in a fair manner. So we might see a transition in terms of the role of the utility, the role of the regulators, and then of course access to what customers have access to, and what kind of services, and trying to ensure that there is good customer education, that customers have opportunities to take advantage of good options, that the market is fly-by-night companies. You know, we haven't seen much of that, but there's always that fear. So you have to make sure that you have, that you have a way of making sure that the market is operating to benefit customers. And then really customer education in the future will be very, very important to let customers know, hey, there's all these options out here. Here's how you can take advantage of it. And then finally, putting that all together to manage the grid and to manage the operation and the flow of electrons so that you've got a reliable grid, but also a grid that enables the opportunity for a lot of clean energy technologies to participate and provide value back. So these are just some of the questions and issues that have to be dealt with, along with who pays for what. And so it's going to be a lot of sorting out, but it's going to be, and states will do it differently, and we'll learn from the best examples. And as we go on, we'll get it better and better.
Kristen, last thoughts?
I think the who pays for what is a great way to end as a last thought, because I think that's a very, one of the things that we've talked about since, I think back at the ComEd AMI pilot in 08, 09, when we were discussing this idea of, well, we'll have third-party services and alternative suppliers will contribute, and this, how can we ensure that people who are benefiting from this infrastructure are paying for it? I think that it's going to be a different challenge to try to describe, define, and have transparent services that we can value at a regulatory level. I think that is interesting and will be very difficult to do. I think we can do it. I think we should do it. I just think it's going to be an interesting question. I think this concept of, customers are probably going to be people beyond those who just have a meter, right? We're going to have to start talking about customers as distributed energy resources, investors, or investors of new technology. How do we bring them in to contribute and then get value from these kinds of investments in a utility is going to be a very interesting question. And I think that Janine's point is well taken. Commissions are going to find themselves, I think, in a very different world. Talking about how ComEd should charge for providing, grid, distributed energy placement support, for example, or interconnection is a very interesting question, and who pays for that, I think, is a great question. I think it's one we definitely want, because that's the kind of things I think we want groups like Utilities ComEd to do, right? And I think as we sift through the who pays for what, it is going to take us to what do we want that utility to look like, and that's going to be a very interesting, very fun conversation.
Mm-hmm. Wow, interesting times ahead. Well, and that is all the time we have today to talk about them. So thanks again to our guests, Janine Migden-Ostrander of the Regulatory Assistance Project and Kristen Munch of Citizens Utility Board for joining us. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Claire Butterfield, the Program Director at ISEIF. Stay tuned for our next conversation on August 13th. And don't forget to check out our website and follow us on Twitter, which you can find in the description below. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.